or get lucky on the turnstile. But
another one.
He glued his own cat to the floor and told Johnny Carson about it with a completely straight face. That single sentence is why Jonathan Winters is still considered the most dangerous guest to ever sit on that couch. Not dangerous because he was mean, dangerous because nobody, not even Carson himself, ever knew what was about to come out of his mouth.
I played, I don't know how many people are familiar with The Little Prince.
Stick around, because what you are about to hear is 15 minutes of pure chaos from a man who could turn a grocery list into the funniest thing you heard all week. Let's start with the basics. Jonathan Winters and Johnny Carson were almost the same age, and that mattered more than people realize. Carson wasn't just hosting Winters, he was matching wits with a peer, a guy who had been doing this since before television even figured out what late night was supposed to look like. When Winters walked out...
Now, another thing we don't have a lot of livestock.
Carson's entire posture changed. He stopped being the host and became the audience. You can hear it in every single clip. The laughter isn't polite. It's the laughter of a man who is genuinely losing control of the interview. Now here's the cat story, and it's one of the strangest things ever said on national television. Winters casually mentions he had been painting his house, some glue spilled on the floor, and in the middle of describing this mundane accident, he drops in that his cat wandered by and got stuck to the ground. He doesn't laugh when he says it. He doesn't wink at the camera.
We've known each other
He just tells it like he's reporting a minor inconvenience, the kind of thing you'd mention to a neighbor over the fence. That commitment to the bit, that refusal to break character even for a second, is the entire secret to why this moment still gets clipped and shared decades later. Carson later admitted that Winters told that story with such a straight face that for a split second, he actually believed it. Then there's the drinking stories, and these hit differently because they feel less like jokes and more like folklore. Winters talks about being pulled over on a snowy highway, sitting in his car in the middle of nowhere, when a state trooper walks up and asks if he needs help.
I said I could always...
Winters tells him the real issue is a philosophical one, whether the bottle of vodka in his hand is empty or not. It's a small moment, barely 20 seconds of screen time, but it captures exactly what made these two men close for over 2 decades. They weren't performing at each other. They were swapping war stories like old army buddies, except the war was just life, and the casualties were mostly bottles. One of the most underrated segments involves Winters inventing an entire character on the spot, a man named Buck Edelhofer, or maybe Dick, or maybe Wayne's second face. The name kept shifting because Winters himself seemed to be discovering the character in real time. He builds this guy layer by layer.
I'm
A Caucasian version of a famous baseball pitcher, a man from somewhere between Wales and nowhere in particular, and every answer contradicts the last one in a way that somehow makes it funnier instead of confusing. This is improv before improv comedy shows existed. No writers, no cue cards, just a man building an entire fictional biography out of thin air while Carson tries desperately to keep up. Winters didn't fit into military life, and he tells that story with more honesty than most comedians ever risk on stage. He talks about constantly being confused about where he actually was, about asking too many questions, about running up to officers and demanding basic information like where exactly they were supposed to be. It sounds like a complaint, but the way he tells it, every sentence lands like a punchline. Carson noted afterward that this particular bit was so strong it noticeably moved the ratings needle within days of airing. That's not something that happens with scripted comedy. That's raw charisma turned into television gold. Then there's the toy train disaster, which might be the single strangest anecdote in this entire compilation. Winters describes what sounds like a genuine catastrophe.
The water went through, and I was setting up the train because Dad was resting.
Blaming himself, insisting he wasn't trying to criticize a toy train company, mentioning that he had just come in from a snowy evening and was petting his dog incorrectly right before everything went wrong. The details never quite add up to a coherent story, and that's exactly the point. He treats a toy train mishap with the gravity of a natural disaster, and the mismatch between the seriousness of his tone and the smallness of the actual event is what makes the audience lose it completely. Winters also had a bit about quitting drinking that manages to be both self-deprecating and devastatingly accurate about how habits spiral. He describes trying to have just a little wine, like something civilized you'd sip at a holiday dinner. But admits that a little wine always turns into a little vodka, which turns into a little scotch, and before he knows it an entire day has disappeared. He delivers the whole thing with this deadpan acceptance, like he's not bragging or confessing, just stating a fact of nature. That honesty, delivered without an ounce of shame, is what turns a potentially uncomfortable topic into one of the most quotable moments of his career. Coming home from the military gave him one of his best true stories, and it doubles as a masterclass in comedic timing. He describes walking through the door and immediately asking his mother where his old toys were, completely forgetting that he was now a grown man in his 20s. Her response is just 4 words, calling him a dummy, and the pause before she says it is doing half the comedic work.
Only do it to a small dog, because if it's got a good-sized head on it.
Winters immediately pivots into a riff about how sensitive he would have been to that kind of insult back in the service, joking that if he'd had a grenade on him at the time, things might have gone very differently. It's dark, it's absurd, and it comes out of nowhere, which is exactly Winters' signature move. Christmas parties become an entire comedic universe in his hands. He describes guests at holiday gatherings like they are strange reptilian creatures, sneaking around with their tongues out, snatching cookies off trays while dressed in formal ties like well-mannered lizards crashing a party. Then he escalates into a story about bringing someone a fruit cake that apparently exploded before it even made it to the car. The exaggeration is the entire engine here. Nobody actually believes his fruit cake detonated, but the confidence with which he describes it makes the mental image impossible to shake. There's a moment where Winters simply can't find a piece of paper on the desk in front of him, and somehow turns a 30-second bit about misplaced notes into one of the biggest laughs of the whole episode. Carson is practically begging him to just answer the question, and Winters just keeps stalling, looking under things that clearly have nothing under them, milking the confusion until the entire studio is in stitches. It's proof that with the right performer, you don't need an elaborate setup.
If you really want to know about Johnny Winters, you would do well to get this book. He's a talented painter.
You just need timing and total commitment to the bit. He also had a bit about hospital greetings that still holds up as sharp social commentary disguised as a throwaway joke. He points out how doctors and nurses say "how are we doing" instead of "how are you doing," like they're suddenly part of your illness, and then answers his own question with a flat, deadpan "not good." It's a tiny observation blown up into a genuinely clever bit, the kind of material modern stand-up comedians still build entire specials around. Even his own parents weren't safe from the material. Winters casually mentions that his mother and father liked to drink, describing a moment where his mother grabbed a bottle from him and it dropped to the floor, followed by an almost tender line where she asks how anyone could have known he'd survive childhood at all. He responds that this is exactly when he decided to put her in a home early. It sounds harsh on paper, but delivered in his voice, with that particular blend of affection and absurdity, it becomes one of the most oddly touching jokes in the entire set. He never mocks his family, he just tells the truth in the funniest possible order.
So I said, come on, kitty, 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 kitty.
School was never his strong suit, and he owns that failure completely instead of hiding from it. He talks about struggling with math, barely surviving geometry, watching classmates finish their work while he was still stuck on the first problem. Then he escalates into a bit about faking arthritis in his feet just to avoid walking to the chalkboard, asking the teacher to bring the board to him instead. It's self-deprecating without ever feeling sad, because Winters frames every failure as a strategic decision rather than a shortcoming. Carson clearly related to the underdog framing, and audiences ate it up because everyone remembers being the kid who couldn't keep up in math class. Now here's where things get technically impressive.
If I had a decent seismograph.
Winters slides into a rapid-fire political impressions segment from a broadcast in January of 1976, and what he does in under 2 minutes is honestly staggering. He becomes senator after senator, shifting his voice, his posture, even his entire worldview character by character, talking about the economy, banking, weird economic theories about stimulating money by overpaying customers at the bank, then pivoting into an elderly politician promoting the idea of turning every day into Halloween, then somehow landing on a bit about plastic vegetables solving agricultural problems. Carson stops being a host entirely during this stretch and just becomes another audience member watching a master work in real time. This wasn't political comedy about ideology.
Was in the coming out of the Depression. You remember that?
Oh, yeah.
About the same age.
It was comedy about performance itself, and that's why it never feels dated even though the politicians themselves are long forgotten. Then there's the pairing that everyone still talks about, Winters sharing the couch with a young Robin Williams. The moment the conversation turns into performance, Carson's entire job shifts from interviewer to referee. These two men clearly speak the same improvisational language, bouncing lines off each other, building on each other's bits instead of competing for laughs. Williams, still early in his career at this point, treats Winters like the elder statesman of the art form, and Winters never once tries to overshadow him. Instead he matches him beat for beat, proving that decades of experience hadn't dulled his instincts one bit. Carson barely needs to say anything during this stretch. He just sits back and enjoys watching two generations of comedic genius collide.
Which is standard, I think, for most fathers to a boy.
And then there's the Emmy story, which might be the most perfectly told anecdote in the whole compilation. Winters describes finding out he'd won an award for his work on a television show, except he wasn't at some glamorous ceremony when it happened. He was at someone's house eating barbecue ribs, hands completely covered in sauce, in the middle of an ordinary evening with friends. The entire joke is built on that contrast, a career-defining honor arriving in the least prestigious moment imaginable. He never inflates the moment or pretends it was more dramatic than it was. If anything, he makes winning an Emmy sound like a minor interruption to a really good meal, and that humility is exactly why the story has been quoted for decades. What makes all of this hold together isn't just the individual jokes. It's the fact that Jonathan Winters never repeated himself. He didn't have a rehearsed set of bits he rotated through appearance after appearance. Every single time he sat down across from Carson, he built something new out of nothing, using nothing but a voice, a face, and an instinct for absurdity that nobody else on television at the time could match. Carson himself said more than once that Winters was the best pure improviser he had ever shared a stage with, and if you watch closely, you can see exactly why.
5. That'll be interesting to see you doing the show at that age, Johnny.
Carson isn't performing during these segments. He's reacting, genuinely and in real time, to a man who was operating on a completely different frequency. Think about what late-night television actually looked like at this point in history. Most guests came prepared. They had a story polished by a publicist, a joke tested in front of a live audience somewhere else first, a safe little anecdote about their new movie or their new album. Winters showed up with nothing like that. He showed up with a mind that treated every single object in the room as raw material. A pencil on the desk became a bit. A missing piece of paper became a bit. A cat near spilled glue became a legendary piece of television history.
Time in that basement, because that's where you do all your painting.
That's where I do all my, I'll do a lot of meditating.
That is an entirely different skill set than telling jokes, and it's part of why comedians decades later still study these clips like they're watching game film. There's also something worth noticing in how Carson handled all of this. A lesser host would have tried to steer things back to a script, would have gotten nervous about dead air or lost control of the pacing. Carson does the opposite. He leans in. He lets the silences stretch just long enough for the tension to build before Winters detonates the punchline. That restraint, that willingness to let another performer completely take over his own show, is a big part of why Carson stayed the king of late night for as long as he did. He understood that some guests need room to work, and Winters needed an entire runway. It's also worth pointing out how physical Winters was with every single bit, even though almost none of it depended on props. Watch his face during the Marine story, watch his shoulders drop and his eyes go wide during the toy train disaster, watch how his entire body seems to shift when he slides into character during the political impressions. Most comedians rely on words. Winters used his whole body as a canvas, which is exactly why so much of this material still lands even decades after the fact, without any context about who the original politicians were or what the toy train company even sold. And underneath all of the absurdity, there's a surprising amount of honesty running through nearly every single story. The drinking bits aren't just jokes, they're confessions dressed up as comedy. The school struggles aren't just punchlines, they're a grown man admitting he never quite fit the mold that everyone expected him to fit into. Even the military story, buried under all the laughs, is really about a guy who never felt like he belonged anywhere he was supposed to belong. Winters never asked for sympathy for any of it. He just handed the audience the truth wrapped in the funniest possible packaging, and let them laugh their way to understanding him a little better.
Like, live chicken or something else, but I...
What are you, a geek or something?
Well, no.
That combination, total commitment to the bit, physical comedy layered under verbal wit, and a surprising undercurrent of honesty, is why this entire era of television still gets rediscovered by new audiences generation after generation. Nobody clips these moments because they're historically important. People clip them because they still make you laugh out loud, cold, with zero context, decades after they first aired. That's the actual test of comedy that lasts, and Jonathan Winters passes it better than almost anyone who ever sat on that couch. If this kind of chaotic, unscripted genius is something you want more of, make sure you're subscribed, because there is a lot more where this came from. Drop a comment with which moment hit you the hardest, because honestly, picking just one favorite from this list is nearly impossible.